It is the 3rd of November, 1942. The sea off the coast of North Africa is black and restless, the kind of cold that gets into a man's bones through his wet wool uniform. Somewhere beneath the surface of the Mediterranean, a German U-boat is running silent at 40 meters, its crew barely breathing, their commander pressed against the periscope housing with his eyes shut, listening. The hydrophone operator has his headphones clamped hard against his skull, and his expression is one of complete, paralyzing terror. He is hearing the sounds of an entire Allied convoy, the thrumming of multiple large merchant vessels, the distant churn of destroyer propellers, the rhythmic mechanical heartbeat of ships moving in formation. He whispers the bearing to his commander. The commander orders a change of course. The U-boat turns away, slipping deeper, running from the danger above. There is no convoy above. There are no destroyers. There is no fleet. There is, at that moment, only a small, unremarkable British vessel moving quietly through the night, trailing behind it a device that makes no sound of its own, yet produces, through water, the convincing acoustic signature of a fleet of 30 ships. The U-boat commander has just been fooled by a machine the size of a garden shed, towed on a wire, operated by a handful of Royal Navy sailors who are, even now, drinking tea. This is the story of the Foxer, the Fido, and the broader family of British acoustic deception devices. A story of ingenuity born from desperation, of physics weaponized not to kill but to confuse, and of how a small team of scientists working in wartime secrecy managed to turn the ocean itself into a theater of illusion. It is a story that has been quietly overlooked in favor of the more dramatic narratives of Bletchley Park and the bouncing bomb, yet its impact on the survival of Allied shipping, and therefore on the outcome of the Second World War, cannot be easily dismissed. To understand why such a device existed at all, you must understand the particular horror of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. By the spring of that year, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant vessels at a rate that genuinely threatened to strangle Britain into submission. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the German submarine fleet from his headquarters in Paris and later Lorient, had developed a tactic he called Rudeltaktik, the Wolf Pack operations, in which multiple submarines coordinated nighttime surface attacks against convoys, overwhelming the escorts with numbers and speed. The results were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank more than 400 Allied vessels. The tonnage lost exceeded 3 million tons of shipping, carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and the raw materials of war. At its worst, a period the U-boat crews themselves called the Second Happy Time, submarines were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could build replacements. The mathematics of the situation were terrifying. Britain was importing roughly 55 million tons of goods annually before the war. By 1942, that figure had been compressed to less than 30 million tons. The island nation was running short of everything. Convoys were the only answer, grouping merchant vessels together and surrounding them with naval escorts. But the U-boats had adapted. They had learned to locate convoys by listening, with sensitive hydrophone arrays, for the cumulative acoustic signature of many ships moving together. A single merchant vessel is relatively quiet at distance. 30 of them, moving in formation, create an unmistakable noise, a low-frequency rumble that carries for kilometers through cold Atlantic water. The challenge, then, was not simply to protect convoys from submarines already in contact. It was to prevent submarines from finding convoys in the first place. And this required something that no one had seriously attempted before: the deliberate manufacture of false acoustic intelligence, broadcast through the ocean, loud enough and convincing enough to redirect an enemy vessel's attention entirely. The men tasked with solving this problem worked at the Admiralty Research Laboratory at Teddington, in southwest London, a facility that had been quietly developing underwater acoustic technology since before the First World War. By 1942, the laboratory's team of physicists and engineers included several figures who would go on to distinguished post-war careers, though their wartime work remained classified for decades. Their brief was in essence to answer a single question: can you make water lie? The answer, it turned out, was yes. But making it lie convincingly required an understanding of how sound propagates through seawater that was, at that point in history, genuinely at the frontier of applied physics. Sound does not travel through water the way it travels, through air. It bends, it reflects off the thermocline layers where water temperature changes sharply, it decays at different rates depending on salinity and depth and temperature. A device that produced the right sounds in the wrong acoustic conditions might fool no one. Getting it right required not just clever engineering but a sophisticated model of the ocean as an acoustic medium. The team's initial approach was almost comically straightforward. They towed noise-making devices, essentially clusters of metal pipes and resonating chambers designed to reproduce the characteristic sounds of ship machinery. Early prototypes, tested in the Thames estuary and later off the coast of Scotland, were promising but imprecise. They produced noise, certainly, but noise that an experienced German hydrophone operator might dismiss as a single small vessel or even a natural phenomenon. What they needed was not just volume, but variety. The acoustic complexity of multiple vessels moving at different speeds, with different engine signatures, at slightly different bearings. The breakthrough came when the team began analyzing captured German hydrophone data alongside recordings made of actual Allied convoys. What they discovered was that the acoustic signature of a convoy was dominated not by the sounds of ships' engines, but by the sounds of propeller cavitation, the millions of tiny bubbles created when a propeller blade moves through water at speed, each bubble collapsing and releasing a characteristic sound. Cavitation is, in effect, the voice of a propeller. Different propeller designs, running at different shaft speeds, produce different cavitation signatures. A large, heavily laden merchant vessel produces a deep, rhythmic cavitation pattern quite different from that of a fast-moving escort destroyer. The Germans had, through years of operational experience, trained their hydrophone operators to identify and distinguish these patterns, to tell a tanker from a freighter, a destroyer from a corvette, by ear alone. If British scientists could reproduce not just noise but the specific cavitation signatures of different vessel types and broadcast them simultaneously from a towed device, they could create the acoustic impression of an entire convoy where none existed. The device that resulted from this insight was, physically, remarkably unimpressive. It comprised a cylindrical steel housing roughly 2 meters long and 40 centimeters in diameter, weighing approximately 200 kilograms, and containing a series of mechanically driven hydroacoustic transducers, essentially underwater loudspeakers, each tuned to reproduce a different cavitation frequency band. Internally, a clockwork-derived cam mechanism varied the output of each transducer in the irregular patterns characteristic of real propeller noise, preventing the signature from being identified as the regular mechanical output of a single device. It was towed at a depth of between 15 and 30 meters on a 300-meter steel cable, placing it well within the acoustic shadow of the towing vessel and ensuring that the device's signature reached enemy hydrophones before the towing ship's own noise. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Production of the device was contracted to a small engineering firm in Birmingham, which had previously manufactured components for the automotive industry. The manufacturing tolerances were tight. The acoustic transducers required precision machining to within half a millimeter to produce the correct frequency output, and early production runs were slow. Records from the Ministry of Supply suggest that by the end of 1942, approximately 40 operational units had been delivered to the Royal Navy, though the exact figure remains uncertain, as production records for several batches were destroyed during an air raid on the contractor's facility in April 1943. Deployment began cautiously, as a complement to existing convoy protection rather than a replacement for it. The device, given the operational designation Q-type acoustic decoy, though sailors assigned to tow it quickly gave it less polite names, was initially allocated to small, fast escorts operating ahead of convoys on known U-boat transit routes. The theory was not to mislead submarines already in contact with a convoy, but to intercept submarines still searching, still in the hydrophone hunting phase of an attack, and direct them towards the Phantom fleet rather than the real one. The tactical reality was messier than the theory. Accounts from escort commanders who operated the device in the North Atlantic through the winter of 1942 to 1943 describe a frustrating, uncertain business. You could not know, in real time, whether the device was working. There were no sensors to tell you whether a U-boat had detected your decoy and turned away, or whether it had simply failed to locate you at all. Success was invisible. What the after-action data eventually revealed, however, was suggestive. Convoy routes that deployed the acoustic decoy ahead of the main body showed, on average, a 23% reduction in submarine contact reports compared to similar routes without the device. The figure comes from a 1944 Admiralty analysis and must be treated with appropriate caution. Convoy operations varied enormously in weather, season, escort strength, and routing, making clean statistical comparisons extremely difficult. But the directional trend was consistent enough to sustain operational interest and continued production. The German response to the device is, in some ways, more revealing than the device itself. German naval intelligence became aware relatively early that something was disrupting their hydrophone operations in the North Atlantic, though they could not initially determine what. A series of intelligence assessments from the Kriegsmarine, recovered after the war, describe bafflement at the acoustic anomalies being reported by experienced U-boat commanders. Phantom convoy signatures that led to wasted attack runs, signatures that seemed to vanish or multiply impossibly. For a period of several months in early 1943, German Naval Command appears to have attributed the problem to equipment faults in their own hydrophone arrays, authorizing a fleet-wide inspection and recalibration program that temporarily reduced operational U-boat availability. The British device had entirely inadvertently caused the German Navy to doubt its own sensors. The German response, once they understood the problem more clearly, was to develop what they called Naxos-U, an updated hydrophone system designed to filter out the repetitive frequency patterns that distinguish the decoy from genuine convoy noise. It was competent engineering, and by late 1943 it had partially neutralized the British advantage. The acoustic arms race that followed was, in miniature, a perfect mirror of the broader technological competition of the Atlantic War, each side adapting to the other's innovations in a cycle of measure and countermeasure that drove both British and German acoustic technology to extraordinary levels of sophistication. The American approach to the same problem was characteristically different. The United States Navy, entering the Atlantic War in December 1941, had its own acoustic research program, centered on the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. The American devices tended to be larger, more powerful, and less subtle than the British equivalents, a reflection perhaps of different national engineering philosophies or simply of the greater industrial resources available. Where the British device aimed to reproduce the nuanced acoustic complexity of real convoy noise, the American equivalents often prioritized raw acoustic power, flooding a wide frequency range in the hope that sheer volume would overwhelm German hydrophone operators. The British, with their long experience of operating in constrained North Atlantic conditions with limited resources, generally regarded the American approach as admirable in its ambition, but somewhat inelegant in its execution. Post-war analysis suggested that the British approach was more effective in the specific context of deep-water Atlantic operations, where acoustic propagation conditions favored the nuanced signature over the broad-spectrum approach. In shallower Mediterranean waters, the American preference for power sometimes proved more reliable. Neither approach was universally superior. The optimal solution, which later Allied devices began to approximate, combined elements of both. The legacy of these acoustic deception devices runs deeper than their immediate operational impact. The engineers and physicists who developed them accumulated in the course of their wartime work an understanding of underwater acoustics that had no peacetime precedent. The techniques they developed for modeling acoustic propagation in stratified seawater, for designing precision underwater transducers, and for analyzing the characteristic sound signatures of different vessel types all fed directly into the post-war development of sonar technology, submarine quieting techniques, and the modern science of underwater acoustic surveillance. Several members of the Teddington team went on to found or shape the academic field of ocean acoustics in British universities during the 1950s and 1960s, a connection that is rarely made in popular histories of the period. The physical remains of this program are sparse. A small number of Q-type acoustic decoy housings survived the war and passed into Admiralty stores, where most were eventually scrapped. One example is known to exist in the collection of the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport in Hampshire, though it is not currently on public display. The internal transducer mechanism, which is the technically interesting part of the device, was removed before storage, apparently on the instructions of a security-conscious officer who did not wish the manufacturing details to become available even to a museum's researchers. The external shell remains, an innocuous-looking cylinder of corroded steel that gives almost no indication of what it once did. Return to that moment in the Mediterranean, on the 3rd of November, 1942. The U-boat commander who turned his vessel away from the Phantom convoy will never know, for certain, what he heard. He will file a contact report when he surfaces. He will describe a convoy at a certain bearing, moving at a certain speed, and he will explain why he broke off the pursuit. Because the escorts were too many, because the tactical situation was unfavorable, because discretion seemed wiser than valor. He will not know that he was turned by a machine the size of a garden shed, towed on a wire by sailors drinking tea. What he heard was water telling lies. What he heard was British physics wearing the mask of an Allied fleet, broadcasting into the dark Atlantic a fiction so convincing that he staked his life on it and changed course. Throughout the worst years of the Battle of the Atlantic, while the codebreakers of Bletchley Park and the engineers of the bouncing bomb rightly earned their place in history, a quieter deception was running in parallel. It asked no drama. It produced no explosions. It did not decode a single message. It simply made the oceans speak in a language that turned an enemy away from the real and toward the imaginary, again and again, in the cold, dark water, until the tide of the war had turned enough that the Phantom fleet was no longer needed. The machine that pretended to be a fleet never fired a weapon. It never sank a ship. It simply convinced men who were trying to kill other men that the killing opportunity had moved away, elsewhere, out of reach, always just over there, over the next horizon. In a war where deception was as valuable as firepower, that was enough.